Welcome to the next episode of Static Feedback. And today we have an exciting guest, Jared White, who's the creator of Bridgetown, a popular Jekyll fork, and has a number of other educational web projects on the web that we're going to discuss today. So welcome, Jared.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, pleasure to have you. And Bridgetown has really stormed onto the scene in 2020 and has come a long way since then. So, yeah, I'm really interested to hear that story and about the future of Bridgetown and the other projects that you're working on.
Oh, sure. Well, like most things that happened in 2020, there's some historical context, but I'll go back a little bit farther and circle around there. But yeah, I've been a web developer for far too long now. Really got started sort of as the web was first taking off. And, the interesting thing is I got into web development essentially as a way to help my band at the time get online. And then friends in the music industry started saying they wanted help with their sites or, artists, whatever. Right. So it was this sort of creative, fun thing, this new medium. And writing was always a part of that too. Like I had a blog basically before that term even came around. I was kind of part of an initial wave there, but alas, was never disciplined enough, being a nerdy teenager with very shiny toys. I never had enough long-term thinking to keep a blog going long enough for it to really, gain a following. So I look back now, like going to Internet Archive, and there's just, website after website after website that lasted, 6 months or something. But yeah, it was all good, right? It was an experience, and it really helps get me into web development as a proper career and working with more and more interesting clients and projects and so forth.
So
eventually,
what stack were you using at that time? I'm just curious.
I got into PHP pretty early on, once that was a thing, and working with PHP kind of helped me to realize I needed to learn more about databases. So. Probably MySQL to start with, right? The LAMP stack. That kept me going for a while. And then I started hearing about this Ruby on Rails thing. And at first I was resistant. I didn't want to learn another language. I was pretty happy with PHP. So I actually tried creating my own sort of Rails competitor framework with just using PHP. Which was fun, and I learned a ton trying to work through all that. But just as I was thinking I was maybe getting to, an early 1.0, Zend announced their own PHP framework, which is funny in hindsight because that never went anywhere. But at the time, I figured, well, I can't compete with Zend. They're the PHP people, so if they have a framework, it's all over for me. So I decided to really dig into Ruby some and kick the tires more with Rails, and ended up falling in love with it, falling in love with Ruby. So that kind of took me off in a different trajectory, and there was a bunch of WordPress stuff still in the mix there for a while, and trying to slog through that. But yeah, eventually I just sort of figured I would standardize around building Rails apps. But then I was kind of like, well, what do you do with content sites, marketing sites, blogs, what have you? And that's when I came across Jekyll. So now we're in I think 2016 or so. And I felt like at that time I was late to the party. Oh, this Jekyll thing, everyone must know about this already. And I'm just finding out that there's this thing called static site generators, which also is funny because those have been around as a concept since pretty much the beginning of the web. But there was a real dip, right? Because they're early on, but then everyone kind of realized oh, you can really go far with dynamic sites and databases and all of that sort of thing. And, no sort of nice workflow around Git and pushing up code like that, right? It's all just FTP and
yeah,
that sort of thing.
I'm glad to leave that in the past. That journey is actually very similar to my story. Like, I started with PHP Code Igniter, and then kind of through that found Rails, got really into Rails, and then Jekyll. It's kind of a natural progression. Makes a lot of sense. And so at that time, you were building websites for clients. So were you building them in WordPress, and you switched to Jekyll during that transition?
Yeah. So prior to Jekyll, I was kind of trying to get out of the WordPress industry, if you will, and just focus on Rails. But then I still want to do some content sites. So I tried playing around with some Rails-based CMSs, and wasn't too thrilled with that landscape. And then when I started playing around with Jekyll, I just really fell in love with that whole process, even though it didn't really solve the editing side of it. But all of the building the website side of it just seemed great. And even though Jekyll was designed in such a way that you don't really need to know Ruby to start using it, for me, I just found it really nice, because if I want to start writing plugins and customizing a bunch of stuff and building up a workflow around it, it was pretty natural. So I ended up essentially building simple editing interfaces for some clients using Rails. It's just sort of this bespoke thing I created for them that would just use Git under the hood to save data and rebuild a preview site and that sort of thing. And so created a string of Jekyll sites that way. Started thinking maybe I would take the sort of CMS-y stuff I'd cobbled together and turn that into a real thing, and maybe that could go somewhere. But then come early 2020, just as the pandemic's taking off, through a few conversations with the folks at that time who were the maintainers team of Jekyll, pretty much got the word that it was just kind of in maintenance mode. It was just kind of, as is to a certain degree, and sure, they'll merge in some bug fixes and some performance enhancements. But if you want big splashy new features, probably not going to happen, which was disappointing to me, because by the time you get to 2020, Jekyll's really starting to feel like, the grandfather of static site generators. And, that's cool. But there's all this new shiny stuff, which, that's a whole topic in and of itself. But let's just say JavaScript was eating the world, and there were all these new platforms out there that just seem like they're going gangbusters.
So what was the shiny straw that broke the camel's back? What was the one feature where you're like, I need this in Jekyll?
Well, again, it's funny to me now, this stuff's always changing so fast, but in 2020, it seemed like you really needed Webpack to do anything cool on the front end. I really wanted to standardize around, front end tooling that you could see across a wide variety of frameworks and all throughout the industry. And so at that time, that was Webpack. I really felt like Jekyll needed a first party sort of Webpack integration where it's we'll handle generating the HTML and sort of basic, pushing assets and copying stuff over and all the templates, all of that stuff, and then use Webpack for your JavaScript and your CSS and things related to that. And there was obviously no way that was just going to be a thing that the Jekyll team took on. And, even if I wanted to contribute stuff, it would just sort of be its own plugin somewhere that is, just community maintained. And I really felt like Rails at that time, they came out with their own Webpack integration, which seemed really nice to me. So that was part of it, but there were just a ton of other features I felt like Jekyll really needed to kind of offer that it wasn't, and the quality of the plugins out there that you might happen to find, kind of fluctuated there.
I think the main one I always stumbled upon is the pagination, just very quite limited in what it could do. And then if you wanted any sort of taxonomy, suddenly you're writing your own plugin, or It's quite limited.
And I just got tired of like on forums seeing like the same questions and the same problems would come up over and over and over again. And I was feeling like this should be a solved problem, right? If folks are continuing to struggle with particular issues, we should be able to solve those issues as the Jekyll community. But when it seemed like that, wasn't really possible, I was kind of at a loss, really. And then I was talking to some folks at a local Ruby meetup here in Portland, and somebody suggested, well, it's open source. You could always just fork it and go off in some new direction. And I'd kind of already had that thought and dismissed it because it seemed bananas. But hearing someone else say it, I was like, oh, yeah, I suppose I could.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because with Jekyll, it's like a blessing and a curse, the connection to GitHub pages. The blessing is that I feel like it was such a big milestone for popularizing static site generators in Jamstack, and the whole ecosystem was really the first like big platform that did that. But the curse is because there's so many Jekyll sites on GitHub pages, makes it very hard to do any sort of breaking change, which then very severely limits what you can do in terms of feature development. So like the fork, I feel like just breaks those chains and kind of allows you to go wild on it. Yeah.
I mean, you could say it's cheating a little bit because you get to benefit from all of that rich heritage without worrying necessarily about any of that backwards compatibility. But like over the intervening years, since 2020, there's been an attempt to sort of, have somewhat of a sense that like, if you've used Jekyll, you could come use what ended up becoming Bridgetown, this new project. If you've used Jekyll, you should be able to start using Bridgetown, and some of the concepts will be familiar. And if you have a lot of markdown files, by and large, you can probably just copy all those over and use them. And so, we've tried to have that sort of migration path as something that we spell out and talk about a bit. And, continuing to be a Ruby-based project, of course, folks that in the past would have, maybe come from a Rails background and looked at Jekyll and been not sure if their Rails skills will translate over. Bridgetown's also done a bit there to provide more features that Rails folks are familiar with. For example, you can create templates using ERB instead of just Liquid. So Rails folks like that. And we have a lot of other options too. We have like a component system, so you can organize your site out of components, which is sort of a mental model a lot of folks like now. Folks are building things with React and Vue or web components. I'm a huge web components fan. And we try to find ways to you can write front-end web components and Ruby components that get compiled on the site, and it can all kind of work together, and you can, use your know-how in more than one place, which I think is really
super cool. Yeah, really cool. I mean, that Liquid, like the ERB support makes, it really rings true for me. I can't remember exactly what it is. Maybe it's like, is it modular in Liquid? The functionality, it either wasn't supported or it didn't quite behave in the way I expected. Something like so simple. And with Liquid, you're like, well, okay, maybe I create custom Liquid, what's it called? Function.
Tags, filters. Yeah.
Or if I don't know how to do that I'm very limited in what I can do. I mean, with ERB, you can do literally anything. So that, that's really cool.
I do like Liquid. I think it's a good, safe templating language, and in contexts where you really need that, obviously it made sense for Shopify to have something like Liquid available on their platform. But yeah, you run into limitations pretty quickly, and generally, if you're building a static site and you're either running it locally or then you're deploying it somewhere, you don't really need it to be safe, because all the code's executing everywhere all the time, right? So you're not trying to protect like your templates per se from nefarious actors. So it's nice to be able to use ERB. And then there's actually sort of a superset of ERB that I put together called Zerbia, which is it's basically ERB if ERB looked more like Liquid. I was trying to combine the best of both worlds there. And some folks have enjoyed using that as well. And I'm always experimenting with like other sorts of templating syntaxes and ways of doing those things. So it's fun.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I just remembered the example I was trying to think of, initializing an array in Liquid. The trick I always use is you have a string and then you split it by nothing, and then you have an empty array that you can add things to, which is kind of funky.
Yeah, it's bringing me back.
I'm keen to go back into your mindset. 2020, you've just forked Jekyll. What's like your vision at that time? Like, what do you want to do with Bridgetown?
Yeah. Well, it was early days of the pandemic. I had lots of free time, nowhere to go. So, I really just started, reading virtually every single line of code throughout the whole Jekyll code base and just taking notes of like, I understand this. I don't understand that. Why is that there? And just trying to find, areas of obvious improvements first. I think one of the first things I worked on was a console, because I felt like it'd be really awesome if you could, just like in Rails or many other frameworks, you could like actually like get into a console and type in like, what data is in these collections, and what does this look like, and does my configuration make sense, and that plugin I wrote, can I test it out here and throw things at it, right? Like I wanted to be able to get at the code in sort of real time there. So I wrote that. That was really cool. I can't even begin to tell you how many times that's been helpful for me. I mean, I just love having an actual console as part of your static site generator. And then, worked on the Webpack integration right away, and then started taking on more ambitious projects. I think probably the hugest shift from Jekyll was to completely rewrite how all the data works under the hood, how all the files get read in. So sort of a weird little quirk of Jekyll, which is one of the things people kept running into, is like you have posts and you have pages, and pages are not posts and posts are not pages. Posts are part of the collections feature, but they're sort of a special collection with their own set of rules. And then you can create custom collections, but those don't work exactly like posts. So like there's all these different things that for historical reasons kind of don't make sense. And like anyone who's used Jekyll for a while kind of knows like, oh yeah, there's some funky little edges there. Yep. Completely redid that whole subsystem in Bridgetown. So there's just one concept called a resource, and your data files, your markdown files, page templates, all those different things are all resources. There's still a concept of a generated page, but that's basically something that a plugin like outputs if it's trying to like generate its own output pages. But essentially all of your own content is all part of resources. And so posts is just a collection, and pages is just a collection, and you can create your own collections, and you can set up the rules that all sort of work together, and you can have taxonomies that all work together. You can even have relationships. You can say like, the product collection, like each product could belong to, like an artist. We could have like a list of artists, and each artist has many products, and each product is by an artist. Like you could create these sort of relationships between, your resources and essentially have a whole data model as if you're using a database, but it's all just files in your Git repo. Yeah,
super cool. Very, very powerful. Like, because I think for a lot of use cases, like you don't need the full database. Like that is enough. It's like, I guess what a database would give you is the full like integrity of those relationships. But if it's like if it's just like listing things on a website, and it doesn't really matter if the artist gets deleted, whether the album gets deleted. I feel like that's a great fit for that problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and if it's all in Git, right, you can always just roll back to previous commit if you accidentally goofed up something.
Exactly.
I love that.
And like, I think that's one thing from the WordPress worlds and the database kind of driven CMS world that is hard to go back to once you've like used Git for this type of website. Just the fear of making an update kind of goes away, and fear of breaking things completely goes away.
Yeah. And I know like generally CMSs will have like a version history, but it's always just like per unit of content. It's not like I want to have another version of the site here, right, that I'm experimenting with, and like maybe that's in its own branch, and I'm playing around with the design and adding new content stuff, and that's like that version of the site, but we still have the production version of the site, and oh, let's create another branch for this other thing, right? Like you can do so much if everything's just right there in Git.
Agreed.
But yeah, so that was part of what I was trying to accomplish with Bridgetown was to smooth out all those rough edges and provide more functionality. And then also the plugin system is all completely new. For the most part, the plugin system of Bridgetown is, has a lot more features than you get out of the box with Jekyll, and also a lot more capabilities. You can really easily like call to another API and essentially create a bunch of new content in memory just based on those API calls. Which is, you can do in Jekyll, but there's no sort of framework level code that says here's how to do it. It's like, knock yourself out, figure it out. So we have documentation for how to, make API calls and generate new resources that way. If you need some data that isn't just there in Git. And just a whole lot of stuff. Of course, also now, like Webpack is sort of old hat, so we've pretty much migrated to ESBuild, which I love. I think ESBuild is probably the last bundler for me. Like I never have any wish or desire to try using any other front-end bundler ever again, except for ESBuild. I just kind of feel like it's perfect. So we have a really nice integration there. And when I say integration, like I'm not sure folks are always aware of what that means. So like ESBuild does have a pretty nice sort of basic command line interface to just say like ESBuild, here's my input file, give me an output file, that sort of thing. But if you want like a bunch of features, be able to do things like glob everything in this folder and import it, and I want to use Sass, and I want to use post CSS, and I want to do this and that, right? And I want to have like a manifest generated so I can get at the output file's unique hashed file name and import that in my HTML, and like all of this sort of stuff. You need a configuration, right? You need some kind of build system. And folks can create their own ESBuild configurations and stuff. But again, like that's a ton of work and might take you hours or days, and like trying to find tutorials online, and maybe those are out of date and you don't know why it's not working. And, maybe somebody has a starter repo somewhere that they created once and that was cool, but then they don't maintain it. With Bridgetown, like we give you a full ESBuild configuration that is pretty much guaranteed to be regularly updated, right? Like every time we update Bridgetown in general, we're double checking that ESBuild is also up to date. And I feel like that's super important, because if someone creates a new site and they instantly want to try out some web components like Shoelace or add Turbo or try out these other things, I just heard of Swap.js, which is this awesome like page animation transitions thing. So like when you go from page to page, stuff can swoop in and fade out and all this cool stuff, right? Like we want to make it really easy that folks can add those tools and it just works, right?
Super cool.
So, yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, I find that always to be painful when starting a new SSG project. It's really cool. It's just, just supported by default. What's been your inspiration, like from like the start of Bridgetown and maybe now? Like it seems like a lot of Rails kind of core philosophies are shared with Bridgetown as well. Yeah, so was that an inspiration, and were any other static site generators an inspiration for you?
Yeah, so I mean, starting out with Bridgetown, I would say Rails was a big inspiration because, you know, Rails has often prided itself as being convention over configuration, right? Like you should be able to type Rails new and have all this stuff work out of the box. And maybe over the years that's become less so just because like it's so complex and there's a steep learning curve to really get started. But, you know, I feel like they really try to work hard to, you know, have that sort of experience rather than like, you need to know 500 things about how to configure and combine all these different libraries before you can get started, right? Like that's just not a great onboarding experience. So yeah, so Bridgetown tries to continue in that vein to be convention over configuration. I sometimes toy with like experimental versions of Bridgetown that have no configuration at all, right? It's just like you just have a file or you just have a folder with some markdown files in it and, you know, one little Ruby file to like kick off the web server or something, and that's it, right? And maybe that's a little too stripped down, but, you know, I'm always trying to think of ways to, you know, maybe make the experience even more simple. And then in sort of like a front-end web world, I would say over the years, and especially in the last few years, it's really become important to me to advocate for web standards. And, you know, Zach Leatherman of 11D has been doing an amazing job of that, and I really admire the 11D project and Zach personally. But there's a whole bunch of folks out there, you know, maybe who work on certain frameworks or libraries where they really do care about, you know, pushing the web forward as an open platform that's based on open standards and trying to be standards aligned as much as possible. And I think not every popular framework or library out there on the front end is that exactly. It's more like we have our own way of doing things that we like. If it doesn't align with web standards, maybe we don't like the web standards. I have a problem with that because I feel like, you know, like if you have a scale, all other things being equal, like whatever is closer to web standards, I feel like automatically should have a lot more weight to it than sort of a bespoke tool. You know, like it's fun to experiment and come out with new tools, and sometimes those blow up, or sometimes the company's large enough that they make something really popular. But like, I feel like choosing tools or techniques that are aligned with web standards as much as possible, you know, vanilla, if you will, like those should be the defaults. And then you can start to like, for specific use cases and specific needs and specific teams, like, maybe we can add this on now. Maybe we can justify that. But it should feel like there's a cost. And I worry a lot these days where it feels like, you know, just choosing this tool or that framework, there's no cost to it, but you have to like beg, like, please let me write a web component or something like that. It feels weird to me. It feels like somehow we need to flip that on its head and kind of reorient. So I'm writing a lot and I'm publishing a lot over it at spicyweb.dev. And sort of trying to create a community there as sort of flowing out of the work I've done on Bridgetown. But the Spicy Web is really focused specifically on sort of web standards and front-end web and trying to advocate for that.
What are you most excited about in that space at the moment?
How long do we have to talk about web components? I'm just such a fan because, you know, I feel like ever since the very early days of the web, you know, there was just one attempt after another to have some kind of like plugin system or widget system or some kind of way to like share code. Like if I'm creating a UI and I want to put a little calendar widget here so somebody can click on it and get a little pop-up calendar and pick a date. Now I have a date, right? Like, how do you do that, right? And like maybe now there's a native input control that you could use. It doesn't look super great, but it is vanilla, so maybe you start there now. But like in the past, things like that, it's like, well, how do you do it? And I think probably the first widespread sort of popular way to do that was using jQuery plugins, right? So there was a whole era of building websites where it kind of felt mandatory that you had to have jQuery, and you had to download a bunch of jQuery widgets to do all these different things on your page. Fast forward in time, and we have web components, which is literally a web standard way of being able to create these reusable components and share them. You can load them literally anywhere. Like I know folks who use web components in WordPress sites. People use web components in React sites. It's harder, but it's possible. People use web components on static sites all the time. I use them all the time on static sites. They're amazing that way. You don't really need a build system in any particular sense other than just sort of your totally standard front-end setup, whatever that might be. So they're great, right? And we also have advances in CSS, like being able to use CSS variables, like real native web CSS variables, which is fantastic. So you can have a whole set of design tokens for colors, for spacings, for borders, shadows, like all of your different stuff for your particular theme, right? You can just define all of that once, and then you can write your own web components or use off-the-shelf web components and apply those variables to all these things, and poof, like your site just looks good because everything is kind of all part of this same theme. So I just get incredibly excited about that. And, there's certain sort of little edge cases or pieces of functionality that are missing. And I think some of the more controversial takes on web components out there focus specifically on those. Like somebody will focus on like, oh, if you use Shadow DOM and you're creating this particular thing and you need to label this and use this ARIA attribute, oh, you can't do this thing. And so it means that it's not accessible. So web components are bad. And it's like, can't we just appreciate the fact that we don't have to write jQuery plugins anymore? Yeah. Like, to me, it's just amazing, like how fast this technology has progressed. And, I'm pretty confident that, some of the remaining sort of edge cases that are funky will get smoothed out in the next couple years. I think all the browser vendors are really motivated to solve these problems and to, help get us over these hurdles, because it's just so much easier. Especially if you're a larger company and you're like, well, we just want one design system. We just want one set of sort of house component library and theming and all that stuff. And then if folks want to use React or Vue or Svelte or just vanilla JS or some other thing, cool, right? Like, use whatever floats your boat, but we just have one design system and it can be used anywhere. And it really feels like such a game changer for the web to have that kind of capability. Yeah, agreed. Like it's really changed a lot of the way I think about developing on the front end. Web components have been, it's just a really cool experience, and removes a lot of the pain of just dealing with components. And like managing the assets associated with a component. So bringing it back to Bridgetown, what is using web components in Bridgetown? What's that experience? So like on the Bridgetown site itself, we're using Shoelace components in a few places. Shoelace is a really cool open source, like truly like all open source, freely available set of components. You can, out of the box get, what do you get? Like buttons, cards, dialog boxes, color pickers, like the slider where you can see like before and after for an image, just like a ton of stuff. And it's really super high quality, amazing stuff. And the developer of Shoelace is working at Font Awesome now. So, they're like investing more resources into Shoelace being kind of get a design system out of a box, right? And then take it from there with whatever customizations you want to do. So I'm a huge fan of Shoelace. We're using it on the Bridgetown site. Bridgetown comes with what's called a bundled configuration. So so Shoelace isn't on your site if you just create a new site, but with a single command, like boom, it'll just install Shoelace, import a few components as an example, and let you take it from there. So with a bundled configuration, you can get started using Shoelace on a site. And there's another project I'll just shout out real quick too, called Open Props. This is headed up by Adam Argyle, who works with the Google Chrome team for DevRel. Just a fantastic guy, and Open Props is a really fantastic project. So if folks are familiar with Tailwind, I'm sure folks have at least heard of Tailwind. You know, one of the perceived benefits is you get sort of a stock set of colors and font choices, borders, spacings, all those sorts of things, and you don't have to really think about like, well, do I do margin top 31 pixels or 2.7 rem, or like, just give me a few presets. I'll use those. That's great, right? Well, you don't really need Tailwind for that because, again, CSS variables, it's part of the web platform. And so what Open Props is it's like all of those tokens for you. Like you want colors, Open Props gives you colors, gives you spacings, gives you borders, gives you shadows, gives you transitions and easings for animations, right? Like all this cool stuff. But just those tokens, and then you can use them anywhere. You can create your own CSS classes, or you can write web components, or you can, wherever you need to apply those tokens, you can just do that. So we have a bundled configuration to install Open Props. But I feel like between Open Props and Shoelace, and then maybe knowing a little bit about just some basic CSS like Grid and Flexbox, you can just like put together a whole theme, and it's not that hard anymore. It's just amazing that we have all this power now. I think back on, days of having to install Bootstrap to get any sort of grid at all. And there's just so much stuff you had to know and to learn to get something like a grid. And now you can create a whole web page layout in just a few lines of CSS grid. It's bananas. I'm just so happy to have that.
Do you think projects like Bootstrap and jQuery, and maybe like SAS or less are like, they're kind of the experimental ground for browser platform, and it's kind of like the browser's just taking the best ideas from those and putting it in the browser.
Oh, sure. Yeah. There's certainly inspiration that comes from popular frameworks and tools, I think, that eventually land in some form, even if it looks a little different, lands in some form in web standards. And I think I've heard the term paving the cow paths, is the sense that like maybe, userland tooling can pave the cow paths in certain ways for developers who are, trying to chase some particular developer experience. And once those cow paths are paved, folks trying to work on new web standards and proposals can look at that and kind of like pick out the little best bits of what those concepts are and find a way to integrate those into existing standards. I think that's a cool process.
Yeah, no, really cool. I want to talk about there'll be like a number of Jekyll users watching this, who have maybe kind of felt the same frustrations you have in terms of like new feature development. And Bridgetown is a fork of Jekyll, and is a very like clear tool to perhaps consider instead of Jekyll. What does that migration path look like for a Jekyll user?
Yeah, so on the Bridgetown site, there's a page about migrating from Jekyll, and kind of lists out a series of steps that you might take. There's no sort of direct upgrade, or it's not really an upgrade, right? Because they're different projects. But there's a way to sort of side grade, right? Like generally you'd create, just a simple new Bridgetown site, and then you could kind of piecemeal pull over like markdown files, images, what have you, copy over some of your liquid code. You might have to tweak it a little bit, but, you could still use many of the same sorts of liquid templates, bring over your SAS files if you have SAS. Bridgetown can support SAS files. Of course, regular CSS, even better. We use Post CSS out of the box, so you might not need SAS, but still, get some benefits like CSS nesting and, variable-based media queries and a few things that are like either not in vanilla CSS or are so new that, maybe browser support isn't quite where it should be yet. But yeah, there's kind of a step-by-step process there of pulling stuff over, and it might take you a day or a few days to kind of tinker with that. But I know folks who've done that. Like folks hop on the Bridgetown Discord and say like, "Oh, I was using Jekyll," or "Oh, I was using Middleman," which is another Ruby-based static site generator, and I've migrated a bunch of stuff over here now, and I'm using Bridgetown. Woohoo! So yeah, folks are doing that, and it's fun to hear about it.
Yeah. Is that where you see most people coming into the project from, is one of those existing static site generator communities, or are they like coming from Rails or, do you have any sense of that?
It really seems to run the gamut. A fair number of folks, of course, familiar with Rails already, and they want to build something that's more of a content site or portfolio or like a little e-commerce, whatever it might be. And they, they can put some of their Rails and Ruby know-how to work for them. Some projects are migrations like we've talked about. And kind of my personal favorite thing is just hearing from folks who are like, I don't really know much Ruby, but I hear folks like Ruby and I wanted to check it out. And I came across Bridgetown, so I'm playing around with it, and that's fun. And I really like that as someone who's an advocate for Ruby. And, sometimes it's folks who used Ruby a long time ago. Maybe they used Jekyll, but like a long time ago, and it was a little painful, and they're kind of like, but they saw Bridgetown and thought they'd give that a try. And now they're really having fun with that. I knew a few folks early on who had used Gatsby because it was the hot new thing, and then realized like, oh, it's kind of painful just having a simple blog built with Gatsby, which has only become more apparent over time. But yeah, finding something much more lightweight like Bridgetown was helpful. And I suspect, Eleventy is also a beneficiary of that, sort of like rolling back the complexity level a bit for sites that don't need to be super complicated. I think there's a lot of that going on right now. But yeah, all sorts of projects.
And what's the future of Bridgetown look like? What are you most excited about?
Let's see. So I'll talk about something that just rolled out and then something that's in the works. So a bit of a sneak preview. Nice. The first thing is we just rolled out I would say like version 0.5 of Islands architecture, which I'm really excited about. This idea that, your primary JavaScript and even CSS bundle could be really super minimal. And then as you go from page to page, like say you want a really complicated form on one page and you really want to use React and React hook form for this really complicated form, but it's just on this one page. You don't need React anywhere else. You just need it on that one page. So with sort of an island there for the form, folks can navigate to that page and boom, React can boot up, the form can boot up, and folks can now interact with it. And actually, we're making use of Zach Leatherman's excellent island web component to help facilitate some of this. So we did the legwork of setting up ESBuild so it could create these separate island bundles. And then with the island web component, like when you go to the page, it can be like, oh yeah, this part of the page is now in view. Like it's not even necessarily when the page loads. It can be like you load the page and you scroll down. It's like, oh, this part of the page is in view. Load the island bundle. And then poof, all of the markup can load for that. So that's really cool. You see lots of frameworks now, like Astro is another popular one that was kind of Islands architecture from day one. Kind of really shook things up there with like, oh yeah, use React over here and Vue over there and our own Astro components that are Zero.js, and it's all good. So I just love that sort of approach. So we're pushing forward on that. And then the sneak preview thing is, there's this super awesome sort of primitive type of interactivity now in JavaScript called signals. You're seeing signals pop up, like the Preact folks have come up with a great signals implementation. Solid's been doing that for a while. Now it's coming to Svelte in the form of runes, as they're called, but it's essentially a take on signals. And it lets you implement what's called fine-grained reactivity. The sense that, like, if I have this complex set of data, but I just changed like one variable, this one variable is the only thing that needs to change right now. Whatever relies on that, like whatever part of the DOM, say, relies on that piece of the data, when that data changes, that precise part of the DOM can update, but nothing else has to update. Nothing else has to re-render. There doesn't have to be a VDOM even. There's no sort of like, execute this huge function all over again and diff what's different or anything, right? It's just like data, targeted DOM update, boom.
Yeah.
So I love signals for front-end development, but what I've started to play around with is signals inside of Bridgetown, which initially sounds kind of bonkers. Like, what would a static site generator need with signals? Well, if you think about it, what is an incremental generation process, right? Like, so if you take your entire site with like 10,000 pages, but you change one variable on one particular page, shouldn't just that one page update and maybe another page that relies on that page, maybe this one archive page over there that like, right? Like you want to have like a dependency tree that flows out so you regenerate a few places, but not all 10,000 pages on the whole site. It's like long build times suck. So signals could be a way to get there, right? Like if your templates are essentially using signals to get at data, then when the data changes, Bridgetown could know, that data change only needs these particular pages to get regenerated now. We understand that dependency graph. Let's just do that. So maybe not a solution for production builds, because maybe that matters less if the site builds in 5 seconds or 30 seconds. Maybe not that big of a deal either way. But if you're like live reloading in development, the difference between 3 seconds and 30 seconds is ginormous, right? Like, yes. You don't want to change some text on a page or change the title of something and then just kind of wait for something to happen.
It's you got to be on Reddit or something else in no time, and 2 minutes is actually 30 minutes.
Yeah. So lots of static site generators have tried solving this, and some by and large have. We're seeing if we can do it in a way that sort of aligns with front end thinking around signals, because just as you want signals to help you do fine-grained activity on the front end, I think we need fine-grained reactivity in the site generator as well to accomplish similar goals. So that's kind of the upcoming project that I'm looking at.
Yeah, that's very exciting. Like like really with Jekyll, that was always a common kind of complaint, is the build speed, particularly when compared with something like Hugo, which is just lightning fast.
And Jekyll has had an incremental generator, but like I would run into just sort of the gaps of that working really fast. Like I'd change something and I'd go over to some other page that relied on a thing that relied on a thing, and well, that didn't get updated, right? Doesn't help me now. So
I don't trust incremental regeneration in Jekyll at all. It's like almost immediately you're going to find a hole in it, and then it's not valuable.
But it's a challenging problem, right? And like
big time.
Sort of the immediate thing you might try doing is like manually trying to specify like, this page relies on this other bit of data, like kind of manually like spell out your dependency graph. But developers don't want to manually have dependency graphs in their minds, right? They just want to throw a bunch of data at the wall and it sticks wherever it sticks. And if you change something, everything that needs to change changes, right? We don't want to have to maintain all this stuff. The computer should be smarter. Yeah. So that's
Rails philosophy, right? Just convention over configuration should just work. That's really exciting. I'm keen to see how that develops. Jared, if people want to get involved in Bridgetown or start using it, how do they get started?
Yeah, so Bridgetown's at bridgetownrb.com. Site there with a bunch of documentation and info on how to get started. We have a Bridgetown Discord as well that folks can join to ask questions or share stuff they're working on, which is always fun. And then at spicyweb.dev, that's sort of the more general front-end focus stuff that I write. And we also have a Discord there where folks are asking questions or sharing links to things all the time. It gets pretty lively in there. Just be forewarned. People have very strong opinions about things sometimes.
The name
we get
Spicy
into it.
We're warned.
Yeah. And then sort of finally, I'll shout out. There's a podcast that I do with my friend Ayush called Just a Spec, which talks about web specifications, and there's a blog I run called thathtml.blog. That's sort of like news about new web standards or new libraries that are standards aligned. But it's all sort of part of that spicy web mix. So if you're in the Discord or you follow us on Mastodon, and we share links out to all that stuff.
Very cool. Thanks for joining us today, Jared, and really excited to see Bridgetown continue to thrive.
Thank you. It's been fun.